This week's lecture is on Julia Alvarez, How the GarciaGirls Lost Their Accent. I'll focus on the theme of assimilation and the novel's narrative style. Julia Alvarez, How the GarciaGirls Lost Their Accent explores themes of migration, cultural identity, memory, and assimilation through the lives of the Garcia sisters, Carla, Sandra, Yolanda, and Sophia. I'll begin by talking about the narrative style of the novel. First, the use of temporal structure, a reverse chronological order to structure the novel. The novel is written in a reverse chronological order, beginning with the sisters' adulthood in the United States back to their childhood in the Dominican Republic. The novel is divided into 3 parts, and each part is framed by a specific time period. For example, part 1 is between 1989 and 1972. Part 2 is between 1970 and 1960. Part 3 is between 1960 and 1965. So what purpose does such a narrative structure serve in the novel? How does it exemplify and amplify the theme of migration, assimilation, and nostalgia? The reverse chronological order creates the following. First, it imitates the way memory functions for the Garcia family, who continue to wrestle with war, trauma, and their diasporic consciousness as migrants in the United States. Second, it reflects the sentiments of nostalgia that helps address the feeling of loss and regret with regard to the Garcia family's migration and longing for home vis-a-vis their inability to feel fully at home in the United States. Third, it rewrites history and recasts character development to help us understand the characters by accessing what and how their lives are shaped with regard to their social cultural background. We learn as the novel progresses backward in time on how the Garcia sisters become who they are separately due to their distinct experience migrating from the Dominican Republic to assimilating into the United States. Next, I want to examine the use of third-person narrative with some exception in the novel. The novel employs a third-person narrator to recount the stories of the Garcia's girls in the United States and the Dominican Republic. The narrator takes the typical third-person narrator perspective of an quote-unquote all-knowing storyteller who takes their readers into the characters' minds, revealing the sisters' inner thoughts and struggles in adulthood as fragments of their childhood surface through the narrative. From the opening scene, the omnipresent third-person narrator reveals to us what is going on in Yolanda's mind when she returns to the Dominican Republic to visit her relatives. Let's take a look at this part of the story. So the old aunts lounge in the white wicker armchairs, flipping open their fans, snapping them shut. Except that more of them are dressed in the grays and blacks of widowhood, the aunts seemed little changed since 5 years ago when Yolanda was last on the island. Sitting among the aunts in the less comfortable dining chairs, the cousins are flashes of color in turquoise jumpsuits and tight jersey dresses. The cake is on its own table, the little cousin clustered around it, arguing over who will get what slice. When their squabbles reach a certain annoying level, they are called away by their nursemaids, who sit on stools at the far end of the patio, a phalanx of starched white uniforms. Before anyone has turned to greet her in the entryway, Yolanda sees herself, as they will, shabby in a black cotton skirt and jersey top, sandals on her feet, her wild black hair held back with a hairband. Like a missionary, her cousins will say, like one of those Peace Corps who have let themselves go so as to do dubious good in the world. The maid stares down at the interlaced hands she holds before her, a gesture that Yolanda remembers seeing illustrated in a book for Renaissance. So this part of the story reveals to us that the third-person narrator, despite being at a distance from the main character, Yolanda, was able to offer the readers this internal thoughts of Yolanda, the main character. This is what I meant by a narrator who is almost all-knowing. However, there are moments in the novel where the third-person narrative slips into a first-person narrative. In this episode's the first-person narrator, Yolanda, the writer and poet, who is also the first character the novel introduces, takes the role of the narrator. The switch between first and third-person narratives allows the novel to balance between personal and objective perspectives, offering readers a well-rounded understanding of the diasporic experience of the Garcia family. The first-person narrative keeps the readers at a distance while observing the characters' lives. The first-person narrative offers intimate access to the thoughts of Yolanda as she tells her version of the story. This first appears in Part 1 under the chapter known as the Rudy Almenhurst story. Let's take a look at such a passage. For example, on page 86 to 87, we took turns being in the wilderness. First one, then another of us would confess our sins on vacation nights after the parents went to bed, and we had double-checked the hall to make sure there were no morals on the coast and island expressions for the coast being clear. Baby sister Fifi held the title the longest, though Sandy, with her good looks and many opportunities, gave her some competition. For a brief few giddy years, I was the one with the reputation among my sisters of being the wild one. I suppose it all started at boarding school when I began getting lots of callers, and though none of these beaux lasted long enough to even be called relationships. So considering that Yolanda is a writer and poet, we can potentially read the novel as her creative attempt to recount her family history through a third-person narrative to maintain distance and hence objectivity. Yet due to the intimacy of the subject matter to her own identity and her lingering struggles to assimilate into American culture, she at times slips into the first person as she reveals more intimate details of her life. It also allows her to speak on behalf of her family in the way this chapter begins with we and us. The third narrative style I want to focus on is that of the setting. The setting that's between Bronx, New York, and Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. The novel's dual setting of the Garcia family's home country and host country helps stage the tension of the diasporic consciousness as a migrant family seeking assimilation in the United States, while longing for their homeland, which they have left due to the political chaos there. Decades later, the GarciaGirls' lives continue to be influenced by their diasporic past between home and host countries. Returning to Santo Domingo as an adult, Yolanda drives her Datsun alone one day up north. All around her are the foothills, a dark enormous green, the sky more a brightness than a color. A breeze blows through the palm below, rustling their branches so they whisper like voices. Here and there, a braid of smoke rises up from a hillside, a campesino and his family living out their solitary life. This is what she has been missing all these years without really knowing that she has been missing it. Standing here in the quiet, she believes she has never felt at home in the States. This is on page 12. And the key is really the last line that when she says, standing here in the quiet, she believes she has never felt at home in the States. Being away from the States, which she has regarded as home for decades, she suddenly realizes that while in a different space, she never really felt at home in the States. I don't want to conveniently assume that the emotions she expresses here translate into how she feels at home in the Dominican Republic, since she has only arrived in her homeland for a few days. Nevertheless, this passage shows us how being away from her home in the United States allows Yolanda to reflect from a distance on her relationship with the United States, the once upon a time host country that her family migrated to escape the war back home. She suddenly realizes she has and perhaps can never fully reckon with her struggles to assimilate and acculturate into her host country. Yolanda's ambiguous relationship with the United States as refracted through the Dominican Republic sets the stage for the depiction of her family and her struggles to assimilate into the American society and culture in part 1 and 2 of the novel. Part 1 of the novel opens in the 1980s, introducing the Garcia sisters as adult women, reflecting on how they have been navigating life in the United States since migrating to the country when they were young. Part 2 continues this journey back to the younger years of their struggle when they first migrated to the United States. Although they have outwardly adapted to American culture, they remain deeply affected by the lingering tensions of cultural dislocation and fractured identity. For the rest of the lecture, I will focus on the themes of cultural dislocation and cultural clash in gender relations. On cultural dislocation, the sisters experience a persistent sense of alienation as they attempt to reconcile their Dominican upbringing with the norms and expectations of American life. Their quote-unquote lost accents serve as a strong metaphor for the gradual erosion of the cultural roots in the process of assimilation. When Papi returns from a visit to the Dominican Republic and proclaims himself, quote-unquote, un Dominican York and becomes a U.S. citizen, Yo-Yo, the presumed narrator in the chapter, A Regular Revolution, exclaimed. This is a quote from Yo-Yo. "You can believe we sisters whirled and paled, wanting to go home. We didn't feel we had the best the United States had to offer." This is on page 107. However, when Mommy manages to get them into girls' prep school, things change. This is again Yolanda speaking as the narrator in this part of the story. "We began to develop a taste for the American teenage good life, and soon Island was old hat man. Island was the hair and nails crowd, chaperone, and icky boys. By the end of a couple years away from home, we had more than adjusted. So home is still here referring to the Dominican Republic. And of course, as soon as we had, Mommy and Papi got all worried they were going to lose their girls to America. Things had calmed down on the island, and Papi had started making real money in his office up in the Bronx. The next decision was obvious. We 4 girls would be sent summers to the island so we wouldn't lose touch with La Familia. The hidden agenda was marriage to the homeland boys, since everyone knew that once a girl married an American, those grandbabies came out jabbering in English and thinking of the island as a place to go get a suntan. This is from page 108 and 109. Despite Papi's decision to become quote-unquote American after feeling disillusioned by his trip back home to the Dominican Republic, the Garcia parents began to fear losing their girls when the girls started assimilating into the American society. The fear is linked to their own fear of losing their cultural roots to the Dominican Republic, and this fear is transferred to their daughters and their future. Language in the form of accents, American versus Dominican, becomes this marker of loss. Next, I want to discuss the cultural clash in gender relations as depicted in the novel. The novel explores the clash between traditional Dominican and American ideals, often liberal ones, the girls subscribe to. For example, in the case of Yolanda, the clash is often one that is between gender expectations in the Dominican culture and the feminist ideals encountered in the US. While struggling with the conflicts between her traditional upbringing and the American culture of individualism, Yolanda questions and resists the patriarchal roles imposed on her by both cultures. For example, in her argument with John, Yolanda feels the strong presence of John's paternalistic and borderline chauvinistic attitude towards her. This is the part of the novel where Yolanda is having a contested conversation with John. What you need is a goddamn string. John's words threw themselves off the tip of his tongue like suicides. She said, what if she did? He didn't have to call them strings. String, he said, string. She said that just because they were different, that was no reason to make her feel crazy for being her own person. He was just as crazy as she was if push made to shove. My God, she thought, I'm starting to talk like him. Push comes to shove. She laughed, still half in love with him. Okay, she conceded. We're both crazy, so let's both go see a shrink. She wins, taking on his language only to convince him. He shoved her peacemaking hand away. She was the one who was crazy, remember? No way was he going to be shrunk. She kissed him in silent persuasion, but she could tell he wasn't convinced. I love you. Isn't that enough? He resisted. I love you more than it's good for me. So this part of the story comes from page 73. The pervasiveness of patriarchal authority John represents is not only coded in the American culture, but also in the English language, as Yolanda notices and highlights the use of words such as shrink and push comes to shove as both dismissive and oppressive. The language is so pervasive that Yolanda notices herself regurgitating them. What is worth noting is when Yolanda uses the same language on John, he openly rejects it and falls back on his quote-unquote love for Yolanda to dismiss her suggestions for a compromise. In addition to struggling with the kind of patriarchal authority from John, who represents the American culture, Yolanda also struggles with the patriarchal authority coming from his own father, Carlos. Here's a passage that shows how Carlos exerts his paternal authority on not only just her daughter, but also on his wife, Laura. The passage comes from page 145. What is wrong with her speech? Carlos wagged his head at her. His anger was always more frightening in his broken English, as if he had mutilated the language in his fury, and now there was nothing to stand between them and his raw, dumb anger. What is wrong? I will tell you what is wrong. It shows no gratitude. It is boastful. I celebrate myself. The best student learns to destroy the teacher. He mocked Yo-Yo's plagiarized words. That is insubordinate. It is improper. It is disrespecting of her teachers. In his anger, he had forgotten his fear of lurking spies. Each wrong he voiced was a decibel higher than the last outrage. Finally, he shouted at Yo-Yo, "As your father, I forbid you to make that a speech." Papi Carlo's inability to understand the significance of Whitman's lines from Song of Myself to Yolanda and her attempt to embrace a meaningful value of American identity and culture leads to his resort of an unreasonable outrage of patriarchal authority. He forbids Yolanda from presenting her speech. With this, I'll end my lecture for this part of my discussion on how the Garcia girls lost their accent. There will be a part 2 to the discussion in the second lecture on the novel and some of the secondary reading materials. Thank you.